Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Before you drift off, it would be a nice idea if you could leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from. Please don't forget to give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. Right, let's get comfy and relaxed, and let's begin. Story 1. There were many times I thought I had escaped the darkness that haunted me, but it had a way of creeping back, a relentless tide that washed over every fragment of light in my life. My latest retreat was supposed to be a fresh start, a sanctuary away from the chaos of the city. The old lighthouse stood tall against the rocky coastline, its white paint peeling like old skin. It was a relic, a forgotten sentinel once trusted by sailors and now left to the mercy of the sea. I'd inherited it from my estranged uncle, a man I had barely known but whose silence had echoed through my childhood. The townsfolk had warned me, their eyes filled with warning as they spoke of the lighthouse. They whispered of the light that had gone out, of the tragedies that swirled around it like fog. But I had dismissed their stories as small-town superstition. I had my own darkness to contend with. As I arrived, the wind howled, sending shivers down my spine. The salty air cut through me, every gust a reminder of the isolation that awaited. The lighthouse loomed above, its towering structure both awe-inspiring and suffocating. I parked my car on the rugged path leading to it, my heart racing with a mix of excitement and dread. This was my chance to reclaim a sense of purpose, a way to escape the memories that clouded my mind. The door creaked open with a dull groan, and I stepped inside, greeted by the musty scent of mold and neglect. Dust motes danced in the beams of fading light that filtered through cracked windows. The interior was a shrine to abandonment, rusted hardware, brittle furniture, and remnants of a life long gone. I found myself wondering how long it had been since anyone had dared to venture into this place. I climbed the spiral staircase, each step protesting under my weight. A chill seeped through the walls, wrapping around me like a cold embrace. As I reached the top, I stood before the lantern room, its glass panels dirty and fogged. I could see the ocean stretching out into infinity, waves crashing violently against the jagged rocks below. It was beautiful yet terrifying, and I felt inexplicably drawn to the edge. Something stirred in the depths of my mind, an echo of stories I had tried to bury. The light once shone bright from this very room, guiding lost souls home. But my uncle had let it dim, and with it, the souls it once protected had slipped into the abyss. I tried to shake off the thought, convincing myself that I was simply imagining things. That night, I pushed the discomfort aside and settled into my new life. The old lighthouse was now my home, and I was determined to make it something more than a ghost of the past. I lit the fireplace, the flames flickering to life, and I felt a warmth that momentarily dispelled the chill. I took a moment to breathe, allowing the crackling fire to soothe my racing heart. The first few nights passed with a haunting stillness. I explored the crumbling rooms, discovering forgotten artifacts that belonged to my uncle, faded photographs, dusty journals, and old maps of the coast. Each item felt like a fragment of a life I never fully understood. The townsfolk had painted my uncle as an eccentric, a man consumed by the dark mysteries of the sea. But as I read through his words, detailing his obsessions and fears, I began to feel the weight of his madness settling on my shoulders. On the fourth night, the storm rolled in. The winds howled like a chorus of lost voices, rattling the windows and shaking the very foundation of the lighthouse. The light had long been extinguished, but something compelled me to climb to the lantern room once more. I needed to see, to understand the tempest that raged outside. With every step, the air grew heavier, thick with tension as if the darkness itself was alive, clawing at the edges of my sanity. I reached the top, panting with effort, and peered out through the grime-covered glass. The sea churned violently, waves crashing against the rocks with a ferocity that felt almost sentient. In that moment, through the sheets of rain and the flashes of lightning, I thought I saw a figure emerge from the depths below. Panic grabbed hold of my heart as I strained my eyes to confirm what I had seen. But the storm obscured my vision, and I was left grasping at shadows, questioning my own sanity. Had I truly seen something, or was it simply the trick of the storm, the product of my imagination tormented by isolation? Doubt gnawed at me as I stepped back from the window, the weight of the lighthouse pressing down on me. The night dragged on, the storm unyielding, and I found myself haunted by the image of that figure. Sleep evaded me, and I paced the creaking floorboards, listening to the wind howl like a beast outside. The lighthouse was alive, the air thick with an unshakable presence that whispered secrets I wasn't ready to hear. With dawn, the storm finally relented, but the unease lingered, a shadow that followed me into the light. I ventured outside, the wreckage of the storm littering the shore, and my heart sank at the sight. The jagged rocks were stained with something dark, and as I knelt to inspect it, the world around me faded. The lighthouse loomed overhead, and I could have sworn I heard it breathe, as if it were beckoning me to uncover its secrets. I stood up, shaking off the feeling of dread, convinced that I would put the past behind me. But deep down, I feared that the lighthouse had claimed me, entwining my fate with its own, a lighthouse that was not just a monument of stone, but a keeper of shadows, waiting for the next soul to be devoured by its darkness. The tide had turned, and I was no longer sure if I could escape the horror that awaited within its walls. The lighthouse loomed like a specter against the evening sky, its weathered stones bruised by years of salt and wind. I stood at the foot of its winding path, my heart drumming a nervous tune. The tales of the place had wrapped themselves around my mind, haunting me even in daylight. They spoke of shadows that danced in the lantern room, moans drowned out by the relentless crashing of waves, and a keeper who had vanished, leaving nothing but a cold light and a chilling legend. Rachel had insisted on exploring the old structure, her curiosity bubbling over like the ocean frothing against the cliffs. "Come on, it'll be fun," she had said, and I had tried to match her enthusiasm. But as dusk draped itself over the landscape, I felt the weight of dread settle on my shoulders. "Are you sure we should be doing this?" I asked, glancing over my shoulder at the car parked far off, its headlights fading against the encroaching darkness. Rachel rolled her eyes, the last light glinting off her tousled hair. "You worry too much. It's just an old lighthouse. What could possibly go wrong?" "What, indeed?" I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss as we walked along the uneven stones that led to the entrance. The air grew thicker, more electric with each step, as if nature itself held its breath. We reached the wooden door, its paint flaking like dried skin. I hesitated, but Rachel nudged me forward. With a creak that echoed like a ghostly whisper, the door swung open. The interior was dim, a stale scent of mildew and salt mixing in the air. My flashlight flickered weakly against the stone walls, illuminating decades of wear. I could see remnants of the past, an old oil lamp, rusted tools, and a faint outline of what had once been the keeper's living quarters. "See? It's just old stuff," Rachel said, her voice buoyant, but even she could not ignore the ominous atmosphere. A chill crawled up my spine as I stepped inside. The floors creaked underfoot, the sound reverberating through the silence. I tried to shake off the unease, focusing instead on the adventure of it. We climbed the spiral staircase, each step heavy with the weight of years gone by. The walls seemed to whisper secrets, telling tales I was not ready to hear. Reaching the top, we entered the lantern room, and the view stretched out before us, a vast sea of darkness, the waves glinting under the slivers of moonlight. Breathtaking, Rachel breathed, stepping closer to the window. I stood back, scanning the room. Dust motes floated lazily in the beam of light, but the light seemed wrong somehow, unnatural. My instincts prickled as I realized it did not feel like a beacon meant to guide. Instead, it felt like a trap, luring sailors into its embrace, promising safety but delivering doom. "Look at this," Rachel called, and I turned to see her examining the light itself, her fingers tracing over the glass. It's still functional. Can you believe it? We should leave, I suggested, unease coiling tighter. It's getting late. She huffed, still wrapped with the discovery. Just a few more minutes. Come on, don't be such a baby. I opened my mouth to protest further, but the chill in the air suddenly deepened. A gust swept through the room, extinguishing my flashlight. Darkness engulfed us, and I could hear Rachel's sharp intake of breath. What was that? I don't know. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Let me find my phone. I fumbled for the device in my pocket, cursing under my breath. The silence in the lantern room seemed alive, pressing in on us. When I finally found it, the screen lit up, casting an eerie glow. I swung it around, illuminating the room, but my heart sank when I saw the shadows shift unnaturally. Did you see that? I asked, fear gnawing at me. Rachel edged closer to the window, peering out as if seeking comfort in the vast expanse of darkness. What? I don't see anything. The air thickened, and a distant sound echoed from below, a low rumble, like the groan of the earth. What was that? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I'm sure it's just the wind, Rachel said, though she didn't sound convinced. The lantern's beam flickered back to life, but I could have sworn I saw something, a silhouette against the distant waves. A figure that shouldn't have been there, standing on the rocks, watching. Did you see that? I repeated, more insistent this time. Rachel turned toward me, her expression shifting to one of concern. What are you talking about? There's someone out there. I moved closer to the window, straining to see through the darkness. But the figure had vanished, swallowed by the night. Stop freaking me out, she said, and I could see her trying to push back her own trepidation. Let's go down, I urged, feeling an instinct to escape the suffocating heaviness. Without waiting for a response, I turned and hurried back down the staircase, my heart racing. As I reached the last step, a cold breath of air swept past me, and I froze. The door we had entered through now stood ajar, a dark maw inviting shadows to creep inside. I stepped back, trembling, suddenly certain we weren't alone. Rachel. I called, my voice shaky. Silence answered. Panic surged as I peered back up the staircase. The lantern room seemed more ominous now, shadows moving with a life of their own. Rachel. I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty space. No answer came, only the resounding silence wrapped around me like a shroud. The lighthouse was alive, a predator in the night, and I was its prey. The wind howled through the cracks in the lighthouse, its mournful wails rising and falling like a living thing. I felt it in my bones as I sat in the peeling chair next to the sputtering kerosene lamp, trying to draw comfort from its meager glow. The storm outside raged with renewed ferocity, crashing waves battering the rocky coast and sending salty spray lashing against the lighthouse's sturdy stone walls. I had thought the isolation would bring peace, but the ever-present roar of the sea gnawed at my nerves like a hungry animal. I had never intended to stay here so long. The lighthouse keeper had left a week ago, turning the keys over to me with a warning I could hardly take seriously. Keep a light on during the storm, and you'll be fine, he had said, his voice low and gravelly, eyes shadowed with unspoken fears. I had given him a dismissive laugh, dismissing his worries as relics of a simpler time, but that was before the storm arrived, before the whispers started. They began as soft murmurs, barely audible over the storm. I had dismissed them as the wind playing tricks, or perhaps remnants of an active imagination fueled by solitude. But as the days stretched into an endless loop of storm and darkness, the whispers grew clearer. They called to me from the depths of the lighthouse, echoing through the narrow corridors and winding staircases. On that third night, sleep eluded me. I stared into the flickering shadows cast by the lamp, fighting the urge to listen, to understand what they were saying. It was just the wind, I told myself. Just the wind. Yet, as midnight approached and the storm outside roared louder, the whispers transformed into a cacophony, a dissonant chorus vying for my attention. I could hear phrases and names, perhaps, slipping through the howling wind like a lost echo. I wanted to hide away, to retreat into my room and shut it all out, but there was an undeniable pull, a compulsion urging me to investigate. I rose from the chair, my legs trembling slightly beneath me, and made my way towards the staircase that spiraled upward. Each step creaked underfoot, the sound swallowed by the raging storm. As I ascended, a chill crept up my spine. The air felt charged, thick with unspoken words and buried memories. I reached the lantern room, the very top of the lighthouse where I had spent countless hours gazing out at the turbulent sea, and uncertainty flooded my senses. The glass encasement around the beacon refracted light in strange patterns, illuminating the space with an eerie glow. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest as I approached the window. The waves crashed violently against the rocks below, and I wondered if I might catch a glimpse of the source of the whispers. The dark sea roiled, but nothing stirred in its depths, nothing out of the ordinary. Yet the whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if they were rising from the very stones that composed the lighthouse itself. I braced myself against the cool glass, pressing closer, trying to discern the words that slithered through the air. It was then that I noticed something. A figure appeared in the corner of my vision, standing amongst the shadows cast by the lantern light. My breath hitched, and I turned slowly, half expecting to see the lighthouse keeper or perhaps some delusion brought on by fatigue. But there was no one. I was alone. Or so I thought. The air shifted around me, charged with an energy I could feel but could not name. I felt the sudden urge to look again, and when I did, the figure was there, definite and real, a dark silhouette against the flickering light. It stood motionless, the outline of a person, yet its features were obscured by shadows. I opened my mouth to call out, but the words just faded on my tongue. "Help me," the figure whispered, its voice a raspy echo that sent chills racing down my spine. In an instant, clarity broke through my fog of disbelief. This was no illusion, no trick of the mind. The figure was real. It was a sailor, perhaps. No, I knew it was a spirit, a remnant of the countless souls lost to the sea, lured in by the lighthouse's deceptive light. The storm intensified outside, the wind screaming as if warning me to turn away, to run. But my feet remained rooted to the ground, and I could not look away from the spectral figure. Its eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to pull me in, inviting me to join it in the depths below. "Help me," it rasped again, and suddenly I felt an overwhelming desire to extend my hand, to reach out to it. What was I thinking? I was about to grasp hold of a ghost. The thought horrified me, and yet the pull was intoxicating. I staggered backward, heart racing, but the figure stepped closer, its form shimmering like smoke caught in the lantern's light. "You can save them," it urged, voice a low hiss against the wind. "You must help them." I shook my head, panic rising, and turned to flee back down the stairs. I had to escape this cursed place, away from the whispers, the shadows, the dead. The storm howled louder, almost mocking my fear as I stumbled through the narrow passage, the walls closing in on me. The voices echoed all around, and I could feel them clawing at my sanity. As I reached the bottom step, I saw a glimmer of light, something bright amidst the darkness. The lantern flickered weakly, struggling to stay alive. I rushed towards it, desperate for its warmth, for its comfort, but as I reached for the flame, the whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar. "Help us!" A powerful gust slammed the door open, and I staggered as the wild wind invaded the lighthouse, extinguishing the flame in an instant. The darkness enveloped me, and the whispers turned to screams, a cacophony of souls crying out for salvation. I fell to my knees, desperation clawing at my throat. In that moment, I understood that I was now alone. The lighthouse itself was alive with memories, haunted by those who had gone before me. I was trapped between worlds, and the storm was merely a veil, concealing the horrors waiting just beyond the light. The next morning broke with an unsettling quietude, as if the world had forgotten to breathe. I awoke to a dense fog that clung to the windows like the ghostly hands of the past. The lighthouse loomed outside, its silhouette ominous against the muted dawn. The storm from the previous night left the air thick, charged with a strange electrical energy. I could almost hear the lighthouse whispering, its very stones steeped in stories of those who had vanished in its shadow. After the events of the previous night, I had thought about leaving. But the weight of my curiosity held me captive. What had happened to the keeper? Why had the beacon gone dark? I needed answers that only the lighthouse could provide. As I threw on my coat, I could feel the air prickling with anticipation. I stepped outside, the fog swirling around my ankles as if trying to pull me back. The salty tang of the sea filled my lungs, but it did little to soothe my growing dread. Each step toward the lighthouse felt heavier than the last. The path was slick with moisture, each footfall echoing in the stillness. I could barely see beyond my own hands, the fog acting like a curtain, separating me from the world I once knew. As I neared the entrance, the door creaked ominously, as if it hadn't been opened in ages. I hesitated, a chill creeping down my spine. I pushed it open, the heavy wood protesting against years of neglect. Inside, the air was stale, filled with dust motes dancing in the dim light. I flicked on my flashlight, its beam slicing through the fog of the interior. The ground floor was cluttered with remnants of the last keeper's life. Old tools lay scattered about, rusting and forgotten. A journal caught my eye, its cover faded but still intact. I picked it up, brushing away the dust. The pages were yellowed, and the handwriting, though shaky, was legible. It told of strange occurrences, of shadows that seemed to move on their own, and of whispers that filled the night. As I read on, my heart raced. The keeper had noted a growing sense of unease, a fear that something was watching him from the darkness of the surrounding cliffs. The last entry spoke of a storm approaching, one unlike any he had experienced before. He wrote of a presence, something that called to him from beyond the waves, luring him into the depths of the ocean. I shivered, the hairs on my neck standing on end. Determined to uncover the truth, I climbed the winding staircase, each step creaking under my weight. The air grew colder, an unnatural chill that seemed to seep from the walls. I reached the lantern room, where the massive lens stood like a sentinel. I ran my fingers across its surface, marveling at the craftsmanship, but a sense of foreboding filled my chest. As I turned to leave, I heard a low, mournful sound emanating from the depths below. My heart raced as I peered down the stairwell. The fog seemed to pulse, and I felt as though I were being drawn into its embrace. I hurried back down, my pulse thrumming in my ears. The lower levels of the lighthouse were darker, the air thicker. I could barely see anything beyond the beam of my flashlight. I explored the storage rooms, finding nothing but more debris. An old oil lantern caught my attention. I fumbled with it, my fingers shaking, and managed to ignite it. The flickering flame cast a warm glow, chasing away some of the shadows. But then I heard it again, a whisper, barely audible, lilting and ethereal. It called my name, or at least, that's what my frantic mind interpreted. I turned, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I stumbled backward, bumping into something solid. Spinning around, I found myself face to face with a figure, pale and gaunt, standing at the entrance to the room. The lantern's light flickered, revealing the spectral form of the last keeper. His eyes were hollow, sunken deep into his skull, and he was dressed in tattered clothes that hung loosely on his frame. "Help me," he whispered, his voice a hollow echo that sent chills racing through my spine. "They're coming." Instinct kicked in, and I turned to flee, but he reached out, clutching my arm with a grip like ice. "You don't understand. You must not let them in." His voice cracked, despair etched into every word. I yanked my arm away and dashed past him, fear propelling me back up the spiraling stairs. I needed to escape, to breathe the fresh air once more. As I burst into the lantern room, the fog outside had thickened, swirling like a living entity. The lighthouse felt alive, responding to some unseen force, its very foundations trembling. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony rising to a fevered pitch. Shadows writhed in the corners of my vision, and I realized too late that the door had slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. The keeper's warning echoed in my mind, "They're coming." I pressed my palms against the heavy door, desperation clawing at my throat as I tugged and pushed. The whispers turned into a wailing chorus, a sound so mournful it pierced through my resolve. I was now alone. Suddenly, the lantern flickered violently, casting elongated shadows that danced on the walls. The air became oppressive, and I felt the very essence of the lighthouse thrumming with a dark energy. I turned back to the keeper, who stood silently, his eyes now full of sorrowful understanding. "Leave this place," he seemed to say, but his voice fell silent, drowned out by the rising tide of darkness enveloping me. I could feel the chill creeping closer, a tangible fear that threatened to consume me. In that moment, I understood the truth. Some stories were never meant to be uncovered, and some places were best left undisturbed. The storm howled outside, a cacophony of wind and rain that battered the lighthouse with an unrelenting fury. The ocean below churned violently, waves crashing against the rocky shore, a monstrous symphony that echoed through the aged stone walls. I stood in the cramped confines of the lantern room, heart pounding, the squall switching between a distant growl and a fierce roar. The beam of light from the lighthouse struggled to penetrate the shroud of rain, flickering as if it too sensed the danger encroaching upon us. It had been 3 days since I had found the journal belonging to the former keeper, a relic of another time filled with strange drawings and unsettling entries. Each page I turned revealed more of his descent into madness, but it was the final entry that haunted me the most. "The light calls to those who should not come," he had written, his handwriting frantic, the ink smeared as if he had written it in a frenzy. I felt the weight of his warning bearing down on me as I paced the metal grid beneath my feet, unable to shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The lantern flickered again, casting long, trembling shadows against the walls, dancing figures that twisted in the corners of my vision. I pressed my palms against the cool glass, peering out into the tempest. The beams swept across the dark waters, revealing nothing but chaos. As the night wore on, I retreated to the cramped living quarters below. The sound of the wind whistling through the cracks made the whole structure creak and groan, a living entity that seemed to echo the storm's fury. Shelves lined with dusty books and sea charts surrounded me like the ghosts of keepers past, but it was the echoes of my own thoughts that kept me company. Alone, I battled the oppressive silence, the ticking clock the only reminder of time slipping away. I had not anticipated how isolating the lighthouse would be, especially with the storm as my only companion. I dug through the drawers, hoping to find something to distract myself, something to hold on to in this growing dread. It was then I stumbled upon an old photograph, yellowed with age. A man stood proudly beside the lighthouse, his crisp uniform a stark contrast to the dilapidation that had since taken hold. Beside him, a woman with striking dark hair smiled brightly, her face full of life as she gazed at the camera. I felt a pang of sorrow for the lives lost within these walls, the joy extinguished like the flame of a candle snuffed out too soon. The storm continued to rage outside, a relentless reminder of the world beyond my isolation. I tucked the photograph into my pocket, desperate for a connection to the lives that once thrived here. Every clap of thunder felt like a whisper urging me to leave, to abandon this cursed place. Yet, something deeper held me in its grip, a morbid curiosity, perhaps, or the inexplicable pull of the lighthouse itself. As night trailed deeper into darkness, I decided to check the lantern. The beam had sputtered again, and I feared the light might fail me at the worst possible moment. I ascended the spiral staircase in the dim glow of my flashlight, each step echoing like a heartbeat in the silence. Upon reaching the lantern room, I was met with an unsettling sight. The light flickered as if it, too, had felt an unseen presence, dimming and brightening in erratic intervals. I began to move the levers, adjusting the lamp when I froze at the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and unmistakably human. My pulse quickened as I turned to the door, dread pooling in my stomach. The footsteps grew louder, echoing against the metal staircase, but the howling wind masked all other sounds. I pressed my back against the wall, my breath shallow, willing myself to remain silent. The footsteps stopped outside the door, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, a soft knock resonated through the air, sending a shiver down my spine. The knock was hesitant, almost tentative, as if the person behind it was unsure of their own actions. I couldn't move, paralyzed by an instinctual fear. What lay beyond that door? Was it the spirit of the keeper, lost in the endless dark? Or something more sinister? The knocking persisted, rhythmically tapping against the heavy wood. I could feel my heart racing, a wild drumbeat in my chest, urging me to respond, to yell out, to flee. But some primal urge held me there, bound to the spot. Whatever waited on the other side, I needed to know. With a shaky breath, I reached for the doorknob, the cold metal biting into my palm. I turned it slowly, dread pooling at the base of my throat. The door creaked open to reveal nothing but the darkened stairwell behind it, the flickering lantern casting grotesque shadows that danced along the walls. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt the lines between reality and imagination blur. Nothing. Just the storm's wrath and the echoes of my own hurried breathing. I was about to close the door when a rush of wind surged through the opening, chilling me to the bone. I staggered back, my flashlight flickering ominously, threatening to go dark, but something in the hallway caught my eye, a figure, barely visible, shrouded in darkness. The air thickened with dread as the figure stepped forward, emerging from the shadows with an unsettling familiarity. I gasped, recognizing the woman from the photograph, the keeper's wife, or at least the ghostly semblance of her. Her eyes were hollowed, the smile long gone, replaced by an expression of sorrow that cut deeper than the storm outside. The light flickered again, and the apparition seemed to reach a hand toward me, beckoning. A whisper echoed through my mind, a plea to follow, to understand. I was drawn to her, to the promise of answers hidden in the storm. But with every ounce of instinct screaming at me to flee, I found myself tethered to my fate in this cursed lighthouse, caught in the grip of a haunting that had only just begun. Story 2. The lighthouse stood alone on the rocky promontory, a sentinel guarding the jagged coastline against the relentless tide. Its paint, once a vibrant white, had faded to a ghostly gray, peeling in strips that fluttered like the wings of restless spirits. I had arrived in the early hours of a dreary autumn morning, the air thick with salt and uncertainty. The town of Eldermere, small and unwelcoming, was barely half a mile behind me, a scattering of houses clinging to the cliffs like barnacles to a ship's hull. My job was supposed to be simple, a weekend caretaker, checking the light, making sure the machinery was functional. The previous keeper had vanished, leaving only a vacant cabin and a pile of unanswered questions. I was eager to escape the confines of my mundane life, but as I crossed the threshold into the lighthouse, I felt an unsettling chill wrap around me like a shroud. The interior was a stark contrast to the chaotic beauty outside. Dust motes danced in the thin beam of light filtering through grimy windows, illuminating the spiraling staircase that ascended to the lantern room. My footsteps echoed against the damp walls, a reminder that I was alone in this forgotten place. One glance back at the door, and the world beyond told me I might not return until my duties were done. I spent the first morning inspecting the equipment, a mix of ancient mechanisms and modern technology. The Fresnel lens gleamed under layers of dust, and I wiped it clean, feeling a strange connection to the keepers who had come before me, their hands worn and weathered, just as I imagined mine would become. The wind howled outside, a mournful song that sent shivers down my spine. It was a sound that seemed to echo stories of storms and shipwrecks, of lives lost and saviors forgotten. As night fell, I settled down with a meager dinner of canned beans and a novel I had brought along. The living quarters were sparse, with a rickety table and a small cot. An oil lamp flickered against the encroaching darkness, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. Each crack and creak of the lighthouse felt amplified, as though the building itself was alive, breathing in tandem with the restless sea. Around midnight, I awoke to a sound that jolted me from sleep, a low moaning that resonated with the crash of waves against the rocks. I sat up, heart pounding, listening intently. It was unlike the wind, more like a voice lost to the elements, calling out from the depths. I brushed it off as my imagination, fueled by fatigue and the isolation of my surroundings, but unease settled like a weight in my stomach. The next day passed in a haze, the strange noise lingering at the edges of my thoughts. Each time the wind whistled through the cracks of the lighthouse, I found myself half expecting it to carry a message, some warning or plea. I resolved to explore the cliffs during the day, to ground myself in reality. The lighthouse was a relic, its purpose fading, yet its presence loomed large in the landscape, towering over the waves like a guardian of forgotten tales. As I ventured out, the briny air invigorated me, but even the beauty of the sea couldn't shake the sense of dread. I scrambled over the rocks, my shoes slipping on the wet surface. I traced the shoreline, looking for signs of the previous keeper, anything that might explain his disappearance. The sea stretched out endlessly, but I felt a pull towards a darkened cave that jutted into the cliffside, half hidden by the mist. A fleeting thought sparked, perhaps he had sought refuge there. With hesitant steps, I approached, peering into the cavern's mouth. The darkness swallowed the light, and I hesitated. A shiver ran down my spine, but curiosity urged me forward. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The cool air brushed against my skin, and the faint scent of decay drifted from the depths. The cave seemed to extend endlessly, winding like a serpent into the earth. I could hear the drip-drip of water echoing within, mingling with the distant roar of the sea. I called out the keeper's name, my voice trembling as it faded into silence. No answer came, but as I ventured deeper, I spotted something glimmering in the darkness, a piece of glass, perhaps, or a shard of metal. I reached for it, feeling an inexplicable connection to the object, yet an ominous feeling prickled at the back of my mind. Then I heard it again, the low moan, closer this time, reverberating through the walls of the cave. Panic surged through me, and I turned, scrambling back towards the entrance. The shadows seemed to stretch, elongating into grotesque shapes as I raced. I burst into the sunlight, gasping, heart racing, the lighthouse looming behind me like a silhouette against the sky. That night, I locked the door to the lighthouse, the clang of the latch resonating like a death knell. I sat on the cot, clutching the novel I had abandoned the night before. The moan had followed me, it lingered in my ears, rising and falling like the tide. I could almost hear words woven into the sound, pleas for help, cries of despair. My mind raced with the thought that perhaps the previous keeper had not simply vanished, but had become a part of something dark and insidious. As the wind howled outside, I fought against sleep, knowing the darkness held secrets I was not ready to face. I needed to uncover the truth, but the lighthouse had its own set of rules, and I was beginning to realize that some stories should remain untold. The lighthouse loomed over me like a sentinel of despair as I stepped away from the crashing waves. The wind whispered secrets through the jagged rocks, and the salty spray clung to my face, a constant reminder of the isolation that enveloped this desolate stretch of coastline. I had decided to stay for the night, drawn by the eerie beauty of the place and the stories that lingered in the local tavern. But now, as dusk settled in, the allure began to fray. I approached the lighthouse, its whitewashed stone dulled by years of salt and storm. The door was slightly ajar, creaking on rusted hinges. I hesitated, the thought of entering a place long neglected making my skin prickle uncomfortably. But curiosity tugged at me, a force stronger than the trepidation that gnawed at my gut. I pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit by the last rays of sunlight filtering through grimy windows. Dust motes danced in the air, suspended in time. A heavy silence wrapped around me, broken only by the distant roar of the sea. I could feel the weight of history pressing down, as if the walls themselves were alive with the ghosts of keepers long gone. As I explored the ground floor, I noticed remnants of a life once full of purpose. Old charts lined the walls, faded and brittle, hinting at storms weathered and ships saved from the brink of ruin. The scent of mildew mingled with the briny air. It felt as though the very essence of the sea had seeped into the bones of this place. I made my way to the spiral staircase that wound upwards, its iron railing cold beneath my fingertips. The steps creaked ominously as I ascended, each echoed footfall amplifying the silence that blanketed the lighthouse. I reached the lantern room, and there it was, the great glass lens, its intricate prisms catching what little light remained. It was a thing of beauty and madness, a beacon that had once held the power to save lives yet now stood still, a monument to what had been. I peered out at the ocean, the waves crashing violently against the rocks below. The sun finally slipped beneath the horizon, and darkness wrapped around the lighthouse like a shroud. A chill swept through me, and I turned away from the view, only to find my heart pounding as I caught sight of something in the corner of the room, a small door I hadn't noticed before. It was ajar, the dark space beyond it beckoning me with an unsettling allure. I approached cautiously, my breath quickening as I placed my hand on the cold wood. With a gentle push, the door creaked open, revealing a narrow passageway that descended into darkness. As I peered inside, an instinctual dread coiled tightly in my stomach, urging me to turn back. But the lure of the unknown was insatiable. With a deep breath, I stepped into the passageway. It was damp and cool, the air thick with the smell of decay. The walls of the tunnel were rough, formed by stones that felt as though they were still settling into the earth. My footsteps echoed softly, each sound swallowed by the oppressive darkness. I reached for my phone, its dim light flickering awkwardly against the surrounding gloom. The beam illuminated fragments of the tunnel's walls, revealing what looked like scratch marks in the stone. They were not recent, they were ancient, as if made by desperate hands clawing against despair. A low rumble echoed through the passage, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very marrow of my bones. I froze, listening intently. The sound grew louder, a distant thundering, as if something immense lurked just beyond my reach. It wasn't the waves, this was deeper, darker, a heartbeat of the lighthouse itself. I turned back to retrace my steps, the urgency of the moment propelling me forward. But the passageway twisted and turned, and soon I realized I had lost my way. Panic surged within me, and I felt the walls closing in, the shadows deepening, grasping at me with icy fingers. Just then, I heard it, a whisper, barely audible, yet undeniably present. It danced around me, fluttering like the wings of a trapped bird. My heart raced as I strained to discern the words that eluded me, the voice wrapped in sorrow and desperation. "Help me!" A chill crawled up my spine. I was not alone. Turning, I pressed my back against the damp stone wall, fighting the urge to scream. The whisper had faded, yet the thread of its plea hung in the air like a noose ready to tighten. I shone my light toward the sound, illuminating a shadow that flitted at the edge of my vision. It was there, just beyond the reach of my phone's beam, a shape hovering, shifting, obscured by darkness. I took a step back, but my foot slipped on the wet stone, and I stumbled. My phone flew from my hand, clattering against the ground. The light flickered and died. Blackness enveloped me, and I was left in silence. My heart raced, pounding against my ribs as I crouched low, trying to steady my breathing. The whispers returned, a chorus of voices drowning in despair, reverberating through the darkness. I felt the coldness wrap around me, a suffocating blanket that threatened to swallow me whole. In that moment, I understood the lighthouse was alive, and it cradled secrets that yearned to be uncovered. But as I crouched in the dark, a new clarity dawned upon me. Some secrets should remain buried, and some lighthouses should never be entered. The morning light filtered through the cracks in the shutters, casting thin lines of gold across the floor. I lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, the events of the previous night replaying in my mind like a broken record. I had come to the lighthouse seeking solitude, a retreat from the chaos of my city life, but now it felt more like a prison. The walls seemed to close in on me, and a sense of dread hung thick in the air. After a restless night, I forced myself out of bed and padded to the tiny kitchen. The kettle whistled sharply, slicing through the silence, and I poured hot water over a tea bag, hoping for some comfort in a cup. The wind outside howled, a living entity that rattled the windows and twisted the rusted metal of the lighthouse. I shivered, pulling my sweater tighter around myself. The previous evening had been unsettling, the storm raging outside as I descended the spiral staircase to the lower level. I had heard a noise, a soft, rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from the door leading to the lantern room. It felt like a whisper, an invitation, and I had been drawn to it despite the creeping sensation of dread pooling in my stomach. Now, with a cup of lukewarm tea in my hands, I glanced at the door, half expecting it to open, half expecting to see something unnatural standing on the other side. The door remained closed, but that didn't ease the tightness in my chest. I moved slowly, my bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor, and I placed the cup down before finally making my way to the door. I paused, the surface of the wood feeling impossibly solid beneath my fingertips. Taking a deep breath, I twisted the handle and pulled it open. The air in the lantern room was stale, filled with the scent of brine and something else, a hint of decay that made my stomach churn. I stepped inside, the light from the morning sun illuminating the room's disarray. Dust motes danced in the light, but the eerie atmosphere remained. I scanned the room, searching for any sign of what could have caused my unease. The lantern, a hulking piece of machinery, stood silent in the corner, its glass prisms gleaming as if mocking me. I had opened it the night before, hoping to find some clue about the noise I had heard. Instead, I found nothing, just the remnants of old oil, a chronic reminder of the lighthouse's forgotten purpose. That was when I noticed the wall. A faint scratch marred its surface, barely visible but undeniable. Curiosity piqued, I approached it, tracing the line with my fingers. It looked deliberate, as if something had clawed at the wall in desperation. I swallowed hard, the taste of fear bitter on my tongue, and I stepped back. Whatever had happened here, it was not natural. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the lighthouse. My heart raced as I turned, scanning the room once more. The sound came from below, a heavy thud that rattled the floorboards. I hesitated, the fight or flight instinct wrestling in my mind, but curiosity won out over my better judgment. I needed to know what was happening. I descended the spiral staircase, each step creaking under my weight. The air grew colder as I moved toward the source of the noise, and shadows seemed to stretch and dance around me, deepening the gloom that clung to the walls. When I reached the bottom, I paused in the small hallway that divided the living quarters from the storage area. A chill ran down my spine, something felt wrong. I stepped into the storage area, the faint light filtering in from a small window. I scanned the shelves lined with jars of long-forgotten supplies, old ropes, and rusted tools. Then I saw it, a heap of something dark and twisted in the corner. My heart jumped into my throat as I approached, the air heavy with the scent of mold and something else, something metallic. I bent down, and the light revealed it to be a collection of bones, small and scattered. A chill of realization washed over me, and I stumbled back, the world tilting on its axis. I recognized them, the remnants of small animals, maybe a seagull or a rat. But they were disturbingly fresh, as if they had been placed there only recently. A knot tightened in my stomach as I understood that something was living here with me, something that thrived on the solitude of the lighthouse. An unnerving noise, akin to a low growl, echoed from deeper within the storage room. It was unnatural, a sound that felt like it had no place in this desolate structure. I took a step back, my heart racing, but the instinct to flee battled with the need to understand what lurked in the darkness. Before I could make a decision, the growl turned into a snarl, and something shifted in the shadows, a hulking figure, poised to pounce. In that moment, I turned and ran, the need for survival igniting a flame within me. I dashed back up the stairs, the heavy footsteps of whatever creature had been watching me pounding behind me. I burst into the lantern room, slamming the door shut and leaning against it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The growling continued, more frantic now, vibrating through the wood as the beast clawed at the door. I pressed my back against it, panic coursing through me as I frantically scanned the room for something, anything, to use as a weapon. The pounding stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that filled the air like a suffocating blanket. My heart pounded in my ears, and I strained to listen, waiting for the slightest sound of movement. The silence stretched on, until finally, I dared to breathe again. But the relief was short-lived. A soft whisper floated through the cracks in the door, a voice that sent ice coursing through my veins. It was low, almost melodic, and it seemed to caress my name. I shuddered, the sound filling me with an unbearable dread. Whatever was in the lighthouse was not just a beast, it was something else entirely, and it knew me. I could not stay here. The lighthouse, once a haven, had become a nightmare. A plan formed in my mind, desperate and fueled by fear. I had to find a way to escape, to leave this place before whatever horror lurked in the darkness claimed me as its next victim. The storm howled outside like a pack of wolves, its icy breath seeping through the cracks in the old lighthouse. I had tried to block the windows with whatever I could find, old furniture, peeling paint, even the rusted metal from the roof, but nothing could entirely shield me from the relentless wind or the creeping dread that curled in my stomach. After the events of the previous night, I felt more like a ghost haunting the decaying structure than its sole occupant. I had spent hours wandering the narrow corridors, listening for any sign of life. The echoes of my footsteps bounced off the worn walls, weaving a disquieting symphony with the wind outside. Somehow, I had thought that the storm would wash away my fears, but it only amplified the shadows lurking around me. I returned to the lantern room, the very heart of the lighthouse. The beam of light had long since dimmed, rendering the glass dome a dismal prison. I studied the intricate lens, wondering how many ships had found their way home beneath its glow. A shiver washed over me as I recalled the night I had first heard the whispers, subtle murmurs that slid through the cracks like smoke. They had come from the depths of the lighthouse, a soft beckoning that pulled at my sanity. I pressed my hand against the cold glass, surveying the tempest below. The waves crashed violently against the rocky shore, their fury reflected in the churning sky. It was then that I saw it, a figure slumped against the rocks, half hidden by the spray. My heart raced, a twisted mix of hope and dread. Was it possible? Had someone else survived the storm? I grabbed the old binoculars hanging by the door and focused on the shape below. The figure was drenched, barely conscious, but I couldn't make out any features. Panic surged through me. Should I go down? It felt foolish to consider risking myself in such weather. But the thought of leaving someone behind gnawed at me like a hungry wolf. With every beat of my heart, the urgency mounted. I dashed down the spiral staircase, each step echoing like a countdown. The lower I got, the more the sound of the storm enveloped me, drowning out reason. My hands trembled against the railing as I descended, the shadows of the lighthouse swirling around me like dark tendrils. When I reached the ground floor, the door to the outside creaked ominously as I unlatched it, revealing a world swallowed by rain. The wind howled like an angry spirit, but I forced myself forward, plunging into the biting cold. The salty air stung my eyes, but I pressed on, driven by an instinct I couldn't quite name. I stumbled over the jagged rocks, desperation propelling me closer to the figure. The waves crashed around me, sending sprays of icy water that soaked through my clothes. As I neared it, I noticed the figure was not just slumped, it was moving sluggishly, as if trying to crawl away from the relentless sea. "Help!" I shouted, my own voice nearly drowned by the storm. The figure turned slightly, and I caught a glimpse of a face pale, gaunt, as if it had just clawed its way back from the grave. My blood ran cold. It was a woman, but her eyes were vacant, devoid of life. "Help me," she croaked, her voice barely audible above the roar of the wind. I rushed to her side, kneeling in the frigid water, my heart racing. I had to get her away from the sea, away from whatever madness had brought her here. "I'm here." "You're safe now," I assured her, though a part of me felt utterly lost. I pulled her body toward the lighthouse, my mind racing with thoughts of what might happen if I left her there. As I dragged her towards the door, I became acutely aware of the shadows lurking at the edges of my vision. They flickered like dying flames, whispering in hushed tones that filled the air around us. I glanced back, but there was nothing, only the churning sea and the relentless storm. The woman groaned, her eyes rolling back as if she were teetering on the brink of consciousness. I fought back my rising fear and shoved open the door, pulling her inside the lighthouse. The moment we crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind us, as if some unseen force had sealed us inside. I laid her down on the cold floor, my hands trembling as I searched for signs of life. "Stay with me," I pleaded, panic creeping into my voice. But as I looked into her face, something shifted in her expression. The vacant eyes began to focus, and I felt a terrifying chill creep down my spine. "Why did you bring me here?" she whispered, her voice dripping with an unearthly calm. It wasn't the question I expected. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee back into the storm that had birthed her, but I was rooted to the spot. I thought you needed help," I stammered, my heart racing. The shadows seemed to swell around us, thickening, coiling like serpents. "Help?" she echoed, a strange smile curling her lips. "Or did you think you could bring me back?" In that moment, the lighthouse shuddered, as if it had heard her words. The walls felt like they were closing in, the very air growing heavy with an overwhelming sense of dread. I realized then that whatever horror had claimed this woman was not done with me yet. The lighthouse was alive, and it was hungry. As she continued to smile, I struggled to breathe, knowing that my fate was entwined with the shadows I had tried so desperately to escape. The storm continued to rage outside, but all I could think of was the darkness lurking within. The storm raged outside, the lighthouse swaying like a ship caught in a tempest. I had thought the worst of the night was behind me after the sun dipped below the horizon, but the howling wind and relentless rain soon proved me wrong. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass of the lantern room, watching the sea churn angrily beneath the flashes of lightning. Each bolt illuminated the tumultuous waves, revealing the dark shapes that lurked just beneath the surface, waiting. I tried to shake off the dread that clung to me like sea salt. My thoughts drifted back to the journal I had discovered the previous evening, its pages filled with the ramblings of the last keeper, Thomas, a man consumed by his own madness. He had written of whispers in the wind, shadows dancing just out of sight, and the relentless pull of the sea. I hadn't believed him at first. It seemed too outlandish, too akin to the legends that locals scoffed at in the bars. But now, as the storm threatened to tear the lighthouse apart, his words echoed in my mind. I returned to the journal, the flickering lantern casting eerie shadows across the pages. It was almost as if the ink was alive, each line pulsating with the memories of the man who had shared his soul within these battered leaves. He wrote about the storms he had weathered and the strange occurrences haunting him. The lighthouse is a sentinel, he had inscribed with a shaky hand. It watches. It knows. It demands. A sudden crash of thunder shook the structure, making the lantern's light flicker dangerously. I gripped the railing, heart racing, feeling the air thicken with foreboding. I glanced outside, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but there was only rain-drenched darkness and chaos. Yet, as I scanned the horizon, a shape caught my eye, something moving out there, beyond the tumult. I squinted against the rain, my heart pounding as I searched for the outline again. It had been there, a fleeting glimpse of something bobbing in the waves. A boat? It seemed impossible amidst the storm, yet a sense of urgency propelled me down the winding stairs. I had to see for myself. The spiral staircase creaked ominously beneath my weight, and the wind howled through the corridors, a sorrowful wail that seeped into my bones. Reaching the main floor, I pushed open the heavy door leading to the observation platform. The wind hit me like a physical force, and I staggered back, bracing myself against the wall. My breath came in ragged gasps. Through the deluge, I focused again on the dark waters. The shape had vanished, or perhaps it was just swallowed by the storm. I cursed under my breath and turned back, ready to retreat inside, when I heard a voice, soft yet insistent, carried by the wind. Help me! Panic seized me, my heart racing at the implication. I hadn't imagined it, the voice was real. I strained to listen, my instinct screaming to return to safety, yet the call was too compelling to ignore. Help me! It came again, an echo that resonated deep within me, pulling me toward the edge. I scanned the turbulent waters for any sign of the speaker, but there was nothing. Just darkness and chaos. Who's there? I shouted, my voice almost lost in the storm. Silence answered me, heavy and oppressive, a void that echoed the dread creeping into my mind. I stepped gingerly to the edge of the platform, the ground slick beneath my feet, searching for any flicker of hope in the abyss. Then, just as I was about to turn back, I saw it again, a figure, pale against the backdrop of a crashing wave. It was fleeting but unmistakable. Help! It was a whisper, a gasp of desperation that gnawed at my resolve. I glanced back towards the lighthouse, considering the wisdom of retreating, but the pull of the unknown gripped me tightly. I was a keeper, after all, meant to protect those lost at sea. Before my mind could catch up to my body, I was already moving, stumbling down the slick rocks toward the shore, the storm drenching me to the bone. My feet slid perilously close to the edge, but I pressed on, fighting against the howling wind. The cries continued, growing fainter but more desperate as I drew near the water. I reached the rocky outcrop where the waves crashed violently, and there I saw her, a woman, her hair streaming like ribbons in the wind, arms outstretched as if she were reaching for something just beyond her grasp. Please, she gasped, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. I can't hold on much longer. I felt a chill, a deeper terror than the storm itself. She looked so real, and yet there was something ethereal in her presence, an otherworldly glow that set my nerves alight. Grab my hand. I shouted, scrambling closer, heart racing with both fear and an instinct to save her. But as I reached out, she faltered, her form rippling like water disturbed by a stone, and the moment stretched impossibly long. The light from the lighthouse flickered, casting strange shadows that danced along the rocks. Her eyes met mine, wide with fear, and then she was gone, swallowed whole by the sea. The scream that erupted from my throat was drowned by the storm, and I stumbled back, the realization hitting me like a wave. She had never been there. She was a mirage crafted by the fury of the tempest. A cold sweat clung to my skin as I staggered backward, horrified. I turned, my mind racing, desperate to escape the storm and whatever malevolence lurked within it. But as I made my way back to the lighthouse, the wind seemed to whisper my name, weaving a dreadful promise into the night. I was now alone, and the lighthouse was far more than a beacon guiding sailors home. It was a guardian of secrets, and I was now part of its dark tale. Story 3. The air was thick with salt, the kind that clung to the skin and pulled at the breath. I had arrived at Woodmore Lighthouse on a blustery afternoon, the kind that promised storms. The clouds loomed low over the sea, dark and restless, as if reflecting the tumult I felt within. I was there to settle my late grandfather's affairs, though I hadn't seen him in years and hadn't thought much of the old man since childhood. Yet, the moment I stepped onto the weather-beaten wooden dock, the lighthouse loomed behind me, a shadowy sentinel against the gray sky. I remembered the stories he used to tell, wild tales about the sea and shipwrecks, but there was always a lingering sense of dread in his voice when he spoke of the lighthouse. It was reputed to be haunted by the souls of sailors who had met their doom on the jagged rocks below, lost to the treachery of the tide. I had dismissed these stories then, as children often do, yet now they echoed in the back of my mind like a distant foghorn. As I walked the path toward the lighthouse, my footsteps were swallowed by the damp ground, and the wind howled around me, creating an eerie symphony of sounds. I pulled my jacket tighter against the chill, feeling a shiver that had little to do with the temperature. The lighthouse itself was a tall, imposing structure, painted white but chipped and worn. Its once bright exterior had faded, just like my memories of my grandfather. The light at its top blinked sporadically, as if it were struggling to stay awake in the gathering darkness. Once inside, the aged scent of brine and mold enveloped me. The interior was surprisingly spacious, yet it felt cramped with remnants of the past, faded photographs of storms at sea, rusting nautical instruments, and a great many ropes and nets, all tangled and forgotten. A hush fell over the place, as if time itself held its breath. I could almost hear my grandfather's voice echoing from the past, warning me against the whispers of the sea. I went through his belongings, dusting off memories I had left behind. There were journals, filled with the scrawled handwriting of a man who had spent his life chasing the horizon. I paused over an entry dated a year before his death, which spoke of strange lights appearing on the water at night, lights that danced and beckoned. He wrote of a growing sense of dread, as if something was watching him from the depths. I dismissed it as the ramblings of an old man losing his grip on reality. Night fell swiftly, the sunset dying like embers in the sky. The lighthouse grew darker around me, the meager light from the lantern flickering in defiance. I should have left, should have returned to the warmth of my car, but something held me there. Perhaps it was curiosity or the last vestiges of familial duty, a need to confront the ghosts of my past. As the wind howled outside, I heard something, a sound like whispers, floating through the halls. I stopped, my heart racing. The sound was indistinct, a cacophony of voices overlapping, hushed yet urgent. My skin prickled as I turned toward the spiral staircase that wound upward into darkness. I hesitated, caught between the urge to flee and the need to explore. The lighthouse had always held a sense of mystery, and I was no longer a child afraid of the dark. I was an adult, and I had come to confront the past. I climbed the stairs slowly, each creak echoing like a warning. As I reached the top, the light from the lantern illuminated the room in a flickering glow, casting unsettling shadows that danced on the walls. The glass casing around the beacon was covered in grime, obscuring the light that had once guided sailors home. I stepped closer, peering out through the grimy panes, the sea crashing below, wild and untamed. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once. The whispers intensified, and I turned sharply. The room was empty. I took a deep breath, convincing myself it was the wind playing tricks on my mind, but then I heard it again. This time, it was clearer, a name, my grandfather's name, carried on the wind. Thomas. My heart stopped. I had always known him as a distant figure, but that night, in the heart of the lighthouse, he became a living presence. I ran back down the stairs, the sound of my footsteps pounding in my ears, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. I needed to leave, but my legs felt heavy, rooted in place. The wind outside screamed, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a figure standing on the rocks below, silhouetted against the crashing waves. The lantern flickered violently, casting shadows that twisted and turned, and I knew then that I was not alone. The whispers grew into a roar, a cacophony of voices blending into a singular, haunting melody. I stumbled backward, colliding with an old trunk that had been pushed against the wall. It fell open, revealing forgotten treasures from the past, maritime charts, rusting keys, and beneath them, a faded photograph. I picked it up, my breath hitching in my throat. It showed my grandfather in the lighthouse, standing beside a woman I had never met, her face obscured, but her eyes seemed alive, staring right into my soul. I dropped the photograph as if it burned me. The whispers crescendoed, drowning out the sound of the wind. I sprinted down the corridor, my heart pounding, the memories and shadows chasing me. All I wanted was to escape, to leave this haunted place behind. But as I burst through the door, the lighthouse emitted a final, ominous blink, and the darkness truly settled in, leaving me with the sinking realization that the past had come to reclaim its hold on me, and I was far from finished with Whitmore Lighthouse. The wind howled through the cracks of the old lighthouse, a mournful sound that seemed to whisper secrets of the past. I had returned to the island the next morning, compelled by a force I couldn't explain. Maybe it was the unshakable feeling that I needed to uncover the truth left behind by the keeper, or perhaps it was the lingering dread that had settled in the pit of my stomach ever since I first laid eyes on the beacon. The salty air felt heavy with expectation as I stepped onto the worn path that led to the lighthouse. Its skeletal silhouette loomed over me, a stark contrast against the bleached sky. The door creaked in protest as I pushed it open, the familiar scent of damp wood and mildew flooding my senses. I had come here before, but this time, a palpable tension filled the air like static before a storm. With each step up the spiral staircase, my heart raced. The lantern room awaited at the top, but so did the shadows that clung to the walls, waiting for me to turn my back. I reached the landing and paused, peering through the thick glass panes that surrounded the lantern. The view of the crashing waves below was mesmerizing yet terrifying, a reminder of the power of the sea. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass, trying to shake off the unease that clung to me. As the sunlight flickered through the glass, I caught glimpses of the treacherous rocks below, jagged and unforgiving. It was no wonder so many ships had met their doom here. The lighthouse had been a savior, but it had also been a witness to countless tragedies. My eyes drifted toward the lantern itself, its mechanism hissing softly as it turned. The light flickered, a heartbeat of a long-dead guardian. I felt drawn to it, almost magnetically. As I reached out to touch the cold metal, a sharp crack of thunder rumbled in the distance, and I jerked back. The storm had come suddenly, a dark mass rolling in from the horizon. Rain began to pound against the roof, a torrent that drowned out the sound of my thoughts. It was then I remembered the diary, the one piece of the keeper's life I had found back in town. My fingers brushed against the pocket where I had tucked it away, but when I pulled it out, the pages felt damp. The ink had begun to bleed. I glanced around the room, hoping to find a place to read it without further ruining its contents. The small table by the window seemed the best option. As I settled down, the storm outside raged, and I felt a sense of isolation, a disconnect from the world beyond the storm. I opened the diary, the musty scent of old paper filling my nostrils. The entries were filled with mundane details at first: the weather, the flares of ships passing in the night, the lonely hours of keeping watch with nothing but the sound of the waves. But then the tone shifted. The words became frantic, scrawled as if the keeper had been running out of time. He spoke of a presence, a shadow that lingered at the edge of his vision, fleeting but persistent. He wrote of whispers that seemed to echo through the halls, voices that called his name, urging him to come closer. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Had I been hearing those whispers? The wind howling outside felt different now, more sinister, as if it carried the weight of the keeper's madness. I turned the pages quickly, desperate to understand the last few entries. They detailed his growing paranoia, the feeling that something terrible awaited him. He mentioned a secret room hidden within the lighthouse, a place he had never dared to enter. I felt a chill creep up my spine. The mention of a hidden room wasn't just intriguing, it felt like an invitation. My pulse quickened as I realized I needed to find it. It was a chance to uncover what had driven him to the brink of insanity, a glimpse into the darkness that had claimed him. The storm outside intensified, the wind shrieking against the lighthouse as if warning me to stop. But I couldn't turn back now. I forced myself to focus, scanning the entry for clues. He had referenced a loose floorboard in the kitchen, a place where secrets might be buried. I hurried down the stairs, the wind roaring as if trying to push me back, but I pressed on. The kitchen smelled of dampness and decay, the wooden cabinets worn and warped. I dropped to my knees, feeling around the floor for the loose board. It took precious seconds, but finally, my fingers found it slightly raised, as if it had been disturbed recently. I pried it up, my heart racing as I pulled it free. The darkness beneath was thick, and as I reached inside, I found something cool and metallic. A small, rusted box. Cautiously, I pulled it out and set it on the table, my hands trembling. The storm outside raged louder, and I felt as though the very foundations of the lighthouse were shaking. I opened the box, revealing old photographs and crumpled letters, their edges yellowed and frayed. The faces in the photos were haunting, eyes hollow and gazing into the distance as if caught in a moment of despair. I sifted through them, feeling a sense of dread wash over me as I recognized the keeper among them, standing with a woman whose face was obscured by shadows. One picture slipped from my fingers and fluttered to the ground. I knelt to retrieve it and froze. It was a picture of the lighthouse, taken from a perspective I didn't recognize. But there, faintly etched into the glass of the lantern, was a shadow, dark and twisted, watching. I glanced back at the box, realizing with a sinking feeling that I had stumbled upon more than just a keeper's relics. I had unearthed a history woven with sorrow and darkness. In that moment, the storm outside seemed to echo the turmoil brewing within the lighthouse, a tempest that threatened to consume everything in its path. I knew then that whatever haunted this place was far from over. It lingered in the shadows, and it was waiting for me. The wind howled through the narrow cracks of the lighthouse, a ghostly sound that reverberated against the stone walls and sent shivers down my spine. I had never been fond of storms, and this one felt worse than any I had ever experienced. It was as if the very air was charged with a dark energy that made my skin prickle. The light from the lantern flickered ominously, casting distorted shadows that danced along the walls, forming fleeting shapes that vanished the moment I dared to focus on them. I had spent the last few days alone, confined to this desolate structure, my only company the endless roar of the ocean and the relentless rain lashing against the windows. The keeper's journal, discovered in a dusty corner of the tower, offered no comfort. It was a collection of ramblings, ink smudged with age, filled with accounts of strange occurrences and disquieting thoughts. I had read it multiple times, searching for clues or patterns that might explain the unease gnawing at me, but it only deepened my sense of isolation. As the storm intensified, I felt an undeniable urge to explore the upper levels of the lighthouse. The spiral staircase was steep, each step a reminder of the daunting height I had yet to conquer. My heart raced as I climbed, the wind screaming outside, mingling with thoughts of what might be waiting for me at the top. The lantern room promised a breathtaking view of the tumultuous sea, but something else tugged at my curiosity, a sense that I needed to confront whatever had been lurking in the shadows of my mind. Reaching the top, I pushed open the heavy door that led to the lantern room, the hinges creaking in protest. The room was dim, illuminated only by the faint glow of the lantern. I stepped inside, and the overwhelming smell of salt and decay hit me. My eyes were immediately drawn to the glass panes that encased the lamp. They were streaked with grime, but through the filth, I could make out the tumultuous waves crashing against the rocky coastline. Yet it wasn't the view that caused my breath to hitch in my throat. In the far corner of the room, half hidden in shadow, I spotted a figure. It was a worn, tattered coat hanging on a hook, but it looked more like a silhouette of a person standing still, like a specter waiting to be acknowledged. I dismissed it, reminding myself of the storm's madness playing tricks on my mind. But the feeling persisted, an oppressive weight settling over me. Lightning suddenly illuminated the room, and I gasped, catching a glimpse of something else, scratches on the wooden floor, deep and deliberate. My pulse quickened as I knelt down to inspect them. They were recent, too recent for a place long abandoned and isolated by the sea. Panic washed over me, and I staggered back against the railing, unable to shake the sensation that I was no longer alone. With trembling hands, I reached for the journal tucked in my coat pocket, flipping through its pages in search of anything that might explain the unease that had gripped me. But as I scanned the entries, the words blurred together, and anxiety gnawed at my gut. The keeper had written about strange happenings, voices carried by the wind, glimpses of figures in the fog, and the long nights spent listening to the cries of seagulls that sounded like whispers. I slammed the journal shut, my heart pounding. I couldn't stay here. I needed to get back to the ground, to the safety of the solid earth, but the storm had other plans. The wind howled through the cracks with an otherworldly scream, and I could swear I heard voices mingling with it, faint whispers that seemed to beckon me to stay. My instinct screamed at me to flee, but curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. Then, a loud crash echoed outside, and the lantern flickered violently. I spun around, peering through the glass, panic flooding my veins as I watched the waves swell higher, breaking against the rocks below with tremendous force. The lighthouse felt less like a beacon of safety and more like a trap, ensnared in the claws of the tempest that raged outside. Suddenly, the door swung open, and I stumbled back, colliding with the railing. A figure emerged, silhouetted against the lightning-lit sky. My heart raced, and I squinted through the darkness. The figure wore the same tattered coat as the one hanging in the corner. In that moment, I realized it wasn't a mere figment of my imagination. "Help me," it rasped, the voice low and trembling like the wind itself. Fear paralyzed me, but I found my voice, barely a whisper. "Who are you?" Trapped, half to warn, the figure stumbled forward, revealing a gaunt face framed by wild hair, eyes wide with desperation. My instinct screamed to run, but I couldn't look away. There was a frantic urgency in the way the figure moved, and something in its eyes spoke of a terror I couldn't comprehend. "What do you mean?" I demanded, though my heart raced with dread. "The lighthouse, there's a darkness," it gasped, collapsing to the floor at my feet. "It wants to claim you too." I couldn't escape. I hesitated, torn between fleeing and offering help. But before I could act, the lantern flickered ominously, and the wind howled like a chorus of tormented souls. The storm intensified, rattling the very foundation of the lighthouse, and I felt the walls begin to close in around me. "Don't let it take you," the figure whispered, eyes wide with horror, as the light flickered one last time, plunging the room into darkness. In that moment, the whispers outside grew louder, a chorus of voices urging me to join them. I didn't know if I was losing my mind or if the lighthouse had truly become a vessel for whatever darkness lay beyond the storm. But as the cold presence enveloped me, I realized I was no longer just an observer. I was a part of this nightmare, and there was no escape. The storm roared like a beast awakened, its growls echoing over the isolated cliffs where the lighthouse stood. I had grown accustomed to the eerie solitude of the place, yet that night the wind howled more ferociously than usual, rattling the old windows and setting my nerves on edge. I wrapped my arms tightly around myself, the chill creeping under my skin and settling in my bones. I had gone back to the lighthouse under the weight of the tragedy that had unfolded just days before, the grief still fresh and raw. The lantern room, usually a sanctuary of light and hope, now felt more like a tomb. I climbed the spiral staircase, each step creaking and groaning as if the fairy would remember my return. Shadows danced on the walls, flickering with the fading light of the lantern that I struggled to keep lit against the tempest outside. I could hear the waves crashing violently against the rocks below, a reminder of the danger that lurked just beyond my sight. At the top, I found comfort in the warmth of the light, but it was a fleeting comfort, as if it too feared the storm. I felt compelled to look out, to see the chaos of the sea, to remind myself that I was still safe within the confines of the lighthouse. As I peered through the glass, the wind whipped my hair back, and I squinted against the spray that lashed at the panes. The ocean roiled, dark and churning, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure amid the waves, a fleeting shape that vanished as quickly as it appeared. I shook my head, dismissing the vision as a trick of the storm. After all, I was alone, and the isolation was beginning to gnaw at my sanity. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the lighthouse had come alive, that it was breathing with its own history, whispering secrets of those lost to the sea. I had read about the tragedies that befell previous keepers, their tales etched into the very stones of the building, and now I felt their presence in the air, heavy and watchful. As night deepened, I descended the stairs to check the fuel for the lantern. The flickering glow cast ominous shadows along the walls, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. The lighthouse was filled with echoes, and every groan of the wood made my heart race. I poured more oil into the lantern, the familiar scent mingling with the dampness that pervaded the air. I took a moment to breathe, steady myself, and then turned to look through the window again. The waves were thrashing harder now, a cacophony of sound that almost drowned out my thoughts. As I stared, I felt that same unease creep over me. Something was out there, something more than the storm. I thought of Clara, the name that hung in the air like an unspoken curse. I had found her diary among the remnants of her life in the keeper's quarters, her scrawled words filled with fear and desperation. She had spoken of visions, whispers in the dark, and shadows that danced just out of sight. I shook my head, trying to dispel the memories that threatened to consume me. The storm was making me jumpy, nothing more. Just as I turned away, the lights flickered, and the lantern sputtered, plunging the room into darkness. My stomach dropped, panic rising as I fumbled to relight the wick. The storm raged, but I was more afraid of the encroaching dark. Once the light flickered back to life, I caught my breath and leaned against the railing, trembling from more than just the cold. Outside, the chaos of the storm seemed to morph into something else, an unsettling calm beneath the fury. I squinted into the darkness, scanning the horizon, half expecting to see that figure again. Nothing but the relentless waves met my gaze, but as I turned my back to the window, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like a whisper or a sigh, drifting through the air. My heart raced. Clara's diary had spoken of voices, and here I was, alone in the very lighthouse she had once inhabited. I strained to listen, but the wind drowned out the sound, leaving me with nothing but the relentless howl of the storm. I rushed down the stairs again, the chill of fear wrapping around me tighter than the damp air. I moved instinctively toward the keeper's quarters, the weight of Clara's presence heavy in the air. I had to confront what I felt lurking within those walls. The door creaked open with a reluctant groan, and I stepped inside, the smell of mildew and salt lingering. The lantern's glow illuminated the remnants of her life scattered about, now just relics of a tragic past. I reached for the diary, half afraid it might open on its own, but instead it lay silently on the battered table. As I flipped through the pages, a gust of wind slammed the door shut behind me. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows deepening, and for the first time, I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. "Clara?" I called out, my voice trembling in the stillness. "Is that you?" The only response was the relentless wind and the crashing waves. But then, faintly, I heard it again, a whisper, chilling and intimate, threading through the darkness. "Help me!" The hairs on my neck stood on end, and I stepped backward, the diary falling from my hands, pages fluttering like trapped birds. I had to leave, to escape this place that felt so alive with despair. I turned to the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged, and I pounded on the wood, desperate to escape the shadows that pressed closer, a storm of their own brewing within the room. In that moment, I realized I wasn't just battling the storm outside. I was confronting something far more sinister, something tied to the very heart of the lighthouse. I had come seeking answers, but now I felt I was being drawn into a darkness I could not comprehend. The whispers grew louder, and I knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning. The storm roared like a beast awakened from slumber, its winds howling and swirling around the lighthouse like a pack of wolves eager for blood. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass of the lantern room, watching the waves lash against the rocky shore below. The jagged cliffs looked merciless under the fury of the sea, and I felt a shiver creep down my spine. The storm wasn't just a fury of nature, it felt personal, as if it had risen to reclaim something lost long ago. My mind drifted to Tom, the last keeper before me, who had vanished without a trace. The townsfolk had whispered stories about him, tales of madness and shadows. I dismissed them as mere folklore until the first time I'd wandered through the lighthouse after sunset. I had felt the air thicken, the shadows lengthen, and an uncanny chill that seemed to crawl under my skin. As the first crack of thunder split the sky, I turned away from the window and moved toward the narrow, spiral staircase. One of the lantern bulbs had flickered out during the storm, and I needed to replace it before visibility dropped further. My footsteps echoed hollowly on the worn stone steps, each sound swallowed by the tempest outside. The lantern room felt suffocating, and I longed for the temporary solace of the lower levels, even if it meant plunging into the darkness. The ladder leading down to the gallery creaked ominously as I descended, the wind's howls intermingling with its groans. On the way down, the cold seeped into my bones, and I felt an overwhelming sense of foreboding. An odd instinct told me I wasn't alone, that the shadows danced differently tonight. The lighthouse had secrets, and the storm seemed intent on unveiling them. I reached the gallery, the dull light from the lantern room barely illuminating the space. I grabbed a spare bulb and hesitated, listening intently. Outside, the storm screamed, but I thought I heard something else, a voice mingled with the roar of the wind. It was faint, almost too soft to grasp, but it lingered at the edges of my consciousness, a whisper that sent the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. "Tom?" I called, my voice quavering in the cavernous space. "Is that you?" Silence fell, but the chill remained, settling deeper into my bones. I shook my head, dismissing the thought. It was just the storm playing tricks on me, the echoes of my mind skewing reality. I focused on the task at hand, unscrewing the old bulb and replacing it with a new one. As I tightened the last screw, a jolt of electricity surged through the air, and the new bulb flickered to life. The brightness flooded the gallery, casting long shadows that danced against the walls, and I felt a brief surge of relief. The storm raged on, but at least I had light. I took a moment to catch my breath, leaning against the metal railing. That's when I saw it, a figure standing on the edge of the cliff outside, silhouetted against the backdrop of lightning. My heart raced, pounding in my ears. I blinked hard, trying to dispel the image, but it lingered, a dark form watching me. I squinted through the glass, straining to catch a glimpse, but the storm whipped fiercely, obscuring my view. "Tom?" I called again, my voice breaking through the howling winds. "Is that you?" My instinct screamed at me to retreat, but curiosity pushed me forward. Maybe he had returned, lost in the storm, seeking refuge. I moved back toward the narrow doorway, pushing against the strong wind as I opened it. The rain poured in, drenching me in an instant. I squinted into the darkness, fear gripping my heart. The figure was gone, vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "Hello?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Is anyone there?" Nothing answered but the pounding rain and the crashing waves. Perhaps it had been a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the storm. I turned back toward the gallery, shaking off the unsettling feeling. But as I did, the lantern room lights flickered ominously, plunging me back into darkness. A spark of panic surged through me. I rushed back up the stairs just as the wind shrieked louder, crashing against the lighthouse with force. When I reached the lantern room, the bulb had gone dim, barely illuminating the towering waves outside. My heart raced as I grasped the switch, flipping it repeatedly, but the light remained faint. I had to get it working again. The lighthouse was a beacon meant to guide ships to safety, and without it, I was trapped, isolated amidst the storm and the shadows. As I fumbled through my toolkit, hoping against hope that I could fix the issue, the whispers returned, louder this time, rising above the storm. They wrapped around me like a cold fog, taunting me with their secrets. "Help us," they seemed to plead, a chorus of voices weaving through my thoughts. My breath quickened, panic surging through me. "Help us." I staggered back, almost tripping over my own feet, and gripped the edge of the table for support. The lantern's light flickered again, and in that brief moment, I saw him, a figure in a diving suit, face obscured by shadows, standing right behind me. My heart stopped. I spun around, but the room was empty. The voices faded to silence, leaving only the howling storm outside. I had to leave. The lighthouse was alive, suffocating me in its grip. I stumbled down the stairwell, desperate to escape the confines of my own mind and the horrors of the past. But as I reached the gallery again, a deep rumble echoed through the stone walls, sending vibrations racing through the floor beneath me. The storm was not just raging outside, it was inside too, awakened by my fear, by the very essence of what lurked in the lighthouse. And then, like the lighthouse itself, I realized I might be trapped in my own shadows, a keeper of a darkness I could not fully comprehend. With each passing moment, the storm outside seemed to grow louder, more insistent. I knew then that I was not merely a keeper of the light. I was part of something much darker, something that stirred in the depths of the lighthouse, something that fed on my fear. Story 4. The lighthouse stood at the edge of Blackthorn Cove, its silhouette stark against the bruised sky of twilight. I had always found a certain allure to the sea, its thrumming waves promising freedom, but the lighthouse was different, an ominous sentinel watching over the dark waters, a grave reminder of all that could go wrong. I arrived on a dreary evening, the scent of salt mixed with damp earth clinging to my clothes as I stepped out of my old Jeep. The wind howled with an anger I couldn't comprehend, whipping fine grains of sand into my eyes. As I approached the lighthouse, its paint faded and chipped, I could almost hear the whispers of the ocean. They beckoned me closer, a siren call I was too curious to resist. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and the musty odor of neglect. Dust motes danced in the light filtering through cracked windows, and I paused, allowing the stillness to seep into my bones. The town had warned me against spending too much time near the lighthouse, sharing stories filled with lost souls and restless spirits. I'd brushed off their tales, attributing them to local superstition. Yet, standing there, I felt an unsettling chill creep up my spine. The lighthouse keeper, an aging man named Eli, had reluctantly agreed to let me stay a few nights in exchange for helping him with repairs. He was a gaunt figure, his face etched with deep lines that spoke of years spent battling the relentless elements. "If the sea doesn't claim you, the lighthouse will," he had muttered under his breath as he led me through the winding staircase to my temporary quarters. I laughed it off, believing he was just another eccentric resident of Blackthorn Cove. My room was small and sparse, just a bed and a rickety desk that faced a window with a breathtaking view of the horizon. The ocean stretched endlessly, its waves crashing against the rocks below, each roar like a threat against the lighthouse's steadfast existence. I settled in and began my research on maritime history, hoping to gather material for my upcoming book. The lighthouse was a perfect subject, shrouded in tragedy and mysteries that begged to be uncovered. As night fell, I found myself gazing out of the window, entranced by the light sweeping across the water. The beam pulsed like a heartbeat, a rhythm I could almost sink my own breath to. Yet, the deeper darkness in the corners of the cove whispered of things I couldn't see, and I felt the weight of unseen eyes watching me from the shadows. Eli had warned me about the storms in this part of the coast, saying they could turn vicious in an instant. I dismissed him, thinking I was more than equipped to handle a little bad weather. That night, however, as I lay in bed, the storm rolled in, the wind shrieking as it shook the very foundations of the lighthouse. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a deep growl that resonated within my chest. It was a sound that felt ancient, primal, as if the earth itself was warning me to leave. Sleep came fitfully, broken by the relentless howl of the gale. I was jolted awake in the early hours by a loud thud, followed by the sound of rattling against the window. My heart raced as I swung my legs over the side of the bed, the cold floor shocking against my skin. The room was shadowed, illuminated only by the intermittent flashes of lightning that cast eerie shapes across the walls. I stepped cautiously toward the window, peering out into the chaos. The waves roared like wild beasts, crashing violently against the rocks below. But what caught my attention was not the storm. It was a figure, a dark shape bobbing in the tumultuous waters, caught in the throes of the storm. My heart dropped as I squinted, trying to discern the details amidst the shadows. It was a person, their form twisting and turning, fighting against the waves as they struggled to stay afloat. Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I darted for the spiral staircase, my mind screaming for action. Maybe I could save them. Maybe it wasn't too late. Each step pounded beneath my feet as I rushed down, my breath coming in desperate gasps. Eli's warning echoed in my mind, but the thought of someone drowning propelled me forward. I pushed through the door that led to the cliffside, the storm enveloping me in a cold embrace that soaked through my clothes instantly. I squinted into the rain, the world reduced to blurred outlines and sheets of water. The figure was still there, a desperate silhouette fighting against nature's fury. I stumbled toward the edge, the ground slick beneath my feet, my heart racing as I saw a way to reach them. The crashing waves seemed to scream in protest, urging me to turn back. Then I heard it, a cry, a haunting wail that sliced through the roar of the storm. It wasn't just a plea for help, it was a sound that resonated with a depth of sorrow that sent chills down my spine. My instinct screamed at me to flee, but otherworldly curiosity anchored me to the spot. I had to know. Suddenly, the figure turned and locked eyes with me, a gaze that pierced through the chaos. It was a face I recognized, twisted with anguish, and in that moment, the world spun around me like a tempest. I staggered back, my breath hitching in my throat. The storm roared louder, and for one fleeting second, I thought I saw recognition of my own horror reflected back at me. As the wind howled and the waves threatened to swallow me whole, I was left standing on the precipice, confronted not just by the raging sea, but by the darkness that resided within the lighthouse itself. The moon hung low over the jagged horizon, bathing the world in a silvery light that felt uncomfortably alive. I had always found solace in the sea, but that night, a creeping dread gnawed at my insides. The lighthouse stood sentinel at the edge of the cliff, its light sweeping across the waves like a restless ghost, illuminating the labyrinth of shadows that seemed to pulse along the shore. I had returned to the island, driven by a mix of nostalgia and an unshakable feeling that something was pulling me back. The locals had warned me, their faces pale and their voices hushed when the conversation turned to the old lighthouse. They spoke of disappearances, of lights flickering in the dead of night, and of whispers that danced on the wind. I had dismissed their tales as mere local lore, the kind that flourishes in small towns, but as I walked the familiar path toward the lighthouse, I could feel the weight of their words pressing against me. The air turned thick with salt and something else, something faintly metallic. I shook my head, attributing it to the residual memories of the storms that had battered the island in years past. Each step toward the lighthouse felt heavier than the last, my boots sinking into the damp earth as if the very ground was reluctant to let me pass. The structure loomed larger as I approached, its silhouette stark against the backdrop of stars that blinked down at me, indifferent to my growing unease. I climbed the spiraling staircase that wound through the lighthouse's core, each creak echoing like a warning bell in my ears. It had been years since I had last visited, but memories flooded back vividly. I remembered the warmth of the lantern room, the way the light had cut through the fog like a sword. I recalled my father's voice, rich with excitement as he taught me how to tend the light. But those memories felt tainted now, overshadowed by the stories I had heard. Reaching the lantern room, I stood still for a moment, absorbing the view. The ocean stretched endlessly, a dark blanket dotted with the occasional glimmer of moonlight. It was beautiful, but there was something in the air, a tension, a sense of being watched. I brushed the thought aside, reminding myself that the lighthouse had always felt like home, a beacon in my otherwise chaotic life. As I turned to inspect the mechanisms, I was startled by a soft thump behind me. The sound had been subtle, almost imperceptible, but it made my heart race. I spun around, expecting to find a wayward bird or a trick of the light, but the room was empty, just me and the wavering shadows cast by the lantern's glow. I forced myself to breathe steadily. Perhaps it was just the wind playing tricks, but paranoia slithered through me. My father had always warned of the lighthouse's charm, claiming it could ensnare the mind. A beacon for the lost, he used to say. But I was not lost. I was here on purpose, to reconnect, to find peace. I took a seat on the worn wooden floor, staring out at the churning sea below. That's when I noticed it. The light flickered, not once or twice, but in a rhythm that felt deliberate, as if it were trying to communicate. I felt cold tendrils of fear creep up my spine, and I stood, moving closer to the glass that encased the lantern. Outside, the storm clouds gathered, dark and swollen, threatening to unleash their fury. My thoughts turned to the tales the fishermen had spun about the lighthouse, about the light that shone brighter when something was lurking just beyond human sight. I began to doubt my earlier dismissals of their warnings. I had heard voices before, but they had always been muffled, lost in the crashing waves. Running a hand through my hair, I turned to the lantern's mechanism, nervously adjusting the wick. The light steadied, but the flickering continued, and I could almost swear that the whispers were growing louder. "Help me, help." The words were indistinct, but they resonated within me, sending chills down my spine. I stepped back from the railing, adrenaline surging through my veins. I had heard the stories of sailors lost at sea, of their voices lingering in the fog, but I had never believed. The wind howled furiously now, rattling the lighthouse, making the walls shudder as if they were alive. I stepped back, my heart pounding, the whispers becoming clearer, more insistent. "Help us." With trembling hands, I grabbed an oil lamp from a nearby shelf, the flickering flames casting erratic shadows that danced across the walls. I moved to the stairs, intent on descending and escaping the building that suddenly felt like a prison. But as I turned toward the door, I noticed something strange. The lantern's light had dimmed, the usual warm glow replaced by an ominous flicker, revealing shadows that danced maliciously. I hesitated, my instinct screaming at me to run, yet a morbid curiosity held me in place. I turned back toward the window, and that's when I saw them, figures rising from the depths of the ocean, faces pale and haunting, their mouths moving in a silent scream, eyes wide and pleading. One figure stepped closer to the shore, the moonlight catching a glimpse of water-soaked clothes, a visage I recognized from the old photographs in my father's belongings. "Dad," I whispered, the name escaping my lips unbidden. My knees buckled, and I stumbled backward, the oil lamp crashing to the floor, casting the room into darkness. The whispers grew louder, filling the void with chaos, wrapping around me like an icy embrace. And in that moment, I understood. The lighthouse was more than a beacon. It was a harbinger, a keeper of secrets buried beneath waves. I was not here to find peace, but to confront a darkness that had awaited my return. As the light flickered back to life, illuminating the room in a ghostly glow, I knew my fate was sealed. The lighthouse had called, and I could not turn away. The storm had been brewing for days, rolling in from the sea like a beast awakening from slumber. It clawed at the horizon, dark and swollen with anger. The lighthouse stood high on its rocky perch, a sentinel against the oncoming darkness. I had always felt its presence as both a comfort and a curse, and now, as the first raindrops began to fall, that duality coiled tighter in my gut. When I had taken the job as the lighthouse keeper, I had imagined solitude. I envisioned long nights filled with the rhythmic sound of the waves crashing against the cliffs, the warm glow of the lantern guiding weary sailors to safety. But now, with the storm howling like a wounded animal outside, I was filled with an oppressive sense of dread, far beyond simple isolation. I had barely begun the evening routine, checking the oil in the lamp and securing the windows against the wind, when I heard it. A low rumble, barely distinguishable from the sound of the storm, seemed to echo from deep within the lighthouse itself. I paused, my heart hammering against my rib cage. It was nothing, I told myself. Just the house settling. But deep down, I knew something was off. As the winds picked up, rattling the panes as if trying to gain entry, I decided to climb the winding staircase to the lantern room. I needed to be sure the light would shine bright against the storm. The wooden steps creaked beneath my weight, each groan amplifying my unease. I could feel the air grow thicker, a sensation that I had grown accustomed to those first few days on the job. It was as if the lighthouse was breathing, the walls expanding and contracting around me. When I reached the top, I was met with a tempestuous view. Waves crashed violently against the rocks, the spray reaching even the lantern room. I set to work, adjusting the wick and filling the lamp with more oil. Each flicker of the flame cast eerie shadows across the room, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move just outside the window. My heart skipped as I turned, but there was only darkness. The lighthouse had been operational for over a century, guiding ships safely through treacherous waters, yet it felt like a relic of a forgotten era. I couldn't shake the feeling that it held secrets, deep-rooted stories intertwined with its very foundation. I recalled the locals' hushed whispers about the lighthouse's history, of keepers who had vanished without a trace. Just a tragic coincidence, I had reassured myself. Yet, as the winds howled louder, a deep chill settled in my bones. I finished my tasks and stepped away from the lantern, feeling more like a ghost than its keeper. I descended the staircase slowly, each step echoing in the empty space. The storm had consumed all light and warmth, and I could only hear the thundering of the sea and the relentless wind. Then, I heard it again. A low rumble, like distant thunder, but it resonated from within the lighthouse. I froze mid-step, my breath catching in my throat. This time, it was accompanied by a soft whisper, almost like a plea. I strained my ears, but the sound was lost in the cacophony outside. I hesitated, caught between curiosity and fear. I turned back to the entrance of the lantern room, feeling a pull as if the lighthouse itself beckoned me to return. I stepped back into the dim light, heart pounding in my chest. The lantern flickered ominously, casting long, twisting shadows along the walls. "Hello?" My voice trembled, swallowed by the storm outside. Silence wrapped around me like a shroud. I stepped closer to the window, peering out into the blackness, searching for the source of the sound. The waves roared below, but the whispering was gone. The lighthouse felt alive around me, and for a fleeting moment, I imagined it had a consciousness, aware of my presence and my fear. I tried to shake it off, but the atmosphere pressed down on me, thick and suffocating. I gripped the railing, grounding myself as I gazed out into the maelstrom. As I turned to leave, I felt a breath of cold air against my neck, sending a shiver racing down my spine. Something brushed against my shoulder, light as a feather, yet heavy with dread. I spun around, but there was nothing there, only the lantern flickering in defiance of the storm. I stumbled backward, my pulse racing. It had been a trick of the wind, surely. I was simply imagining things. But as I descended the staircase, the feeling of being watched did not leave me. It accompanied me like a shadow, relentless and suffocating. Once back in the main room, I tried to steady my breathing, pouring myself a cup of lukewarm coffee. I needed clarity, something to anchor me. But the shadows danced around me, and the whispers returned faint, beckoning, rising above the storm's roar. I clenched my jaw, willing myself to resist the urge to give in to the fear. I had come here to find peace, to escape the noise of the world. I couldn't let a little storm and some unexplained sounds drive me away. But deep down, I knew this place was not what it seemed. The lighthouse had its own history, one that wrapped around it like the waves against the rocks. And as the night deepened, the storm raged on, I realized I was no longer just a keeper of the light. I was trapped within its haunting embrace, and something was waiting for me to uncover its dark truth. The wind howled like a mournful spirit, a lament that echoed through the remnants of my sanity. It had been 3 days since I had taken refuge in the lighthouse, and each night felt longer than the last. I had hoped the isolation might stave off the creeping dread that had settled into my bones, but instead, it wrapped around me like an unshakable shroud. The storm raged outside with a violent fury, rain slapping against the glass like frantic hands begging to be let in. Inside the lantern room, the lantern's flame flickered nervously, casting long shadows that twisted and contorted along the damp stone walls. I felt as though the shadows were the very manifestations of my fears, lurking just out of sight, eager to pounce. I had heard whispers in the night, voices that danced just beyond the threshold of comprehension. They carried snippets of history, tales of shipwrecks and lost souls, of sailors who had sailed too close to the rocks. I tried to shake them off as figments of my imagination, the product of too much isolation and not enough human interaction. But deep down, I knew better. On the third day, I ventured down the spiral staircase, the steps creaking underfoot as if protesting my desire to explore. My breath formed clouds in the chilly air, and each inhalation was punctuated by the scent of salt and mildew. The lighthouse basement, once a place of safety, now felt like a tomb, filled with forgotten relics of the past. A rusted lantern lay toppled on the floor, the glass shattered, its glow extinguished long before I arrived. I picked it up, the weight of it heavy in my hand, and examined the remnants of its once bright light. There was something eerie about it, a sense of abandonment that sent a shiver dancing along my spine. I had dismissed the locals' warnings about the lighthouse, the rumors of it being cursed, but the more I lingered in this place, the more I felt their truth. I caught sight of a weathered journal tucked beneath a stack of old, decaying fishing nets. Dusting off the cover, I flipped through the pages, the brittle paper crackling like an old fire. It belonged to a keeper named Elias, whose entries spoke of dark times, of visions and voices that haunted him. He wrote of a figure he called the Watcher, a looming presence that appeared on stormy nights, watching over the waves for lost souls. I could almost hear his frantic scrawl as I flipped through the pages, his desperation echoing in my ears. He had described how the figure would take shape in the light, revealing a ghastly face that twisted into a mask of horror. I could feel Elias's fear seep into me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I pressed my palms against the table, grounding myself, reminding myself that this was just a story. But the lighthouse had a way of making the unreal feel tangible. The walls seemed to breathe, pulsating with the weight of the air around me. Whether it was the effect of the storm or something else, I felt a shift in the atmosphere, a thickening that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I closed the journal, a small voice inside me warning that I had unleashed something I was not prepared to face. Night crept in once more, the storm still raging outside, each crack of thunder rattling my nerves. I made my way to the lantern room, pushing open the door to find the light flickering gently. A sense of vulnerability washed over me. The lighthouse had become my sanctuary, yet with every passing hour, it transformed into something more sinister. Suddenly, I felt a chill that slithered up my spine, freezing me in place. I turned slowly, scanning the room, but the flickering flame offered no comfort. Shadows slinked along the walls, dancing in time with the storm outside. In that moment, I realized the whispers I had dismissed were louder now, clearer, rising above the turmoil of the night. "Help us." The voice was guttural, a raspy echo that sent ice coursing through my veins. I stumbled backward, my heart racing as I pressed my back against the cold stone wall. The words were not just echoes of the past, they were a plea, an invitation to discover what lay beneath the surface. "Help us," it cried again, this time more insistent, and I could feel the air grow thicker, charged with an unholy energy. I hesitated, torn between fleeing and giving in to the pull of the unknown. The journal had spoken of the Watcher, of its hunger for souls. What if the lighthouse was a beacon not for lost sailors, but for something far worse? Before I could make sense of my racing thoughts, the lantern extinguished, plunging me into darkness. The wind screamed outside, and I fumbled for the door, desperate to escape the unseen menace. But when I reached for the handle, it would not budge. Panic surged as I realized I was trapped. A distant rumble echoed through the stairs, a low growl beneath the howl of the storm. My breath quickened as I felt the air shift again, thickening, coiling tightly around me. The whispers turned into a cacophony, eerie and dissonant, filling my ears until I could no longer think. Then I saw it, a figure emerging from the shadows, twisting into form as if pulled from the very fabric of the night itself. It wore the face of a sailor, eyes hollow and dark, a gaping maw that threatened to swallow the light whole. The Watcher had come for me. I stumbled back, heart pounding furiously in my chest. The walls of the lighthouse leaned in, and the whispers crescendoed into a frantic plea. I was no longer an observer to the horrors of the past. I had become entangled in them. The lighthouse pulsed with a life of its own, and I was afraid that it was hungry for more than just stories. Desperation clawed at my throat as I grasped for the door once more. The figure moved closer, the shadows encircling me. In that moment, I understood that I was the one being watched. The night pressed in like a weight on my chest, thick and stifling as I huddled in the corner of the lantern room. The wind howled outside, a banshee's wail that sent shivers coursing through my skin. I clutched my arms tightly around my knees, staring into the darkness beyond the glass. The light, which had once felt like a comforting companion, now flickered erratically, casting dancing shadows that morphed into grotesque shapes. It was hard to believe I had only been here a week. Each day had blurred into the next, but the events of the previous night were etched in my mind like scars. I still tasted the salt of my own fear and the lingering scent of brine mixed with something foul. After my encounter with the figure, the thing on the rocks, sleep had evaded me. It lurked in the edges of my consciousness, a nightmare I could not shake. The lighthouse emanated an oppressive energy, a heaviness that wrapped itself around me. I could feel its pulse, a rhythmic thrum resonating through the stone walls. The lighthouse had held the secrets of the sea for decades, but now it was whispering something dark, secrets that clawed at the edges of my sanity. I should have been more afraid of the sea than the structure itself, yet it felt as though they were intertwined in some sinister dance. I stood, my legs unsteady as I approached the window, peering out into the tumultuous sea. Below, waves crashed hungrily against the rocks, each roar echoing the despair I felt creeping into my soul. The moon was obscured by dense clouds, casting the world into a twilight of confusion. It had been hours since I had last seen the beacon of light flicker to life, illuminating the darkness to guide lost souls. Now, it stood still, as if waiting for something or someone. My thoughts drifted to the old journals I had found on the dusty shelf in the living quarters. They chronicled the lives of those who had come before me, each entry steeped in an unsettling mixture of duty and dread. The last entries spoke of disappearances, of keepers who had ventured into the night and never returned. Had they seen what I had? Had they felt the same sinister pull of the lighthouse? Suddenly, a loud thud reverberated through the lantern room, causing me to jump back. Heart racing, I turned toward the door. The wood creaked ominously. I could almost hear my own pulse thrumming in my ears, drowning out the storm. I held my breath, straining to listen. Another thud followed, then silence. Was it just the wind? Or something more? Compelled by a force stronger than my fear, I stepped toward the door, the chill of the metal handle sending a jolt through my body. My hand hovered for a moment, hesitating, before I finally twisted it open. The night air rushed in, bringing with it the stench of decay, mingled with the salty tang of the sea. The staircase spiraled down, shadows clinging to the walls like old memories, whispering warnings I could not comprehend. I descended slowly, each step echoing in the silence like a countdown. My flashlight flickered, barely cutting through the gloom. I reached the bottom, the door to the living quarters slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning me. I pushed it open, and the sight before me made my stomach churn. Furniture lay overturned, as if a tempest had swept through, tossing aside anything in its path. Papers fluttered like trapped birds, scattering across the floor. I spotted a dark stain on the wood, thick and congealed, its source unidentifiable yet unmistakably ominous. My mind raced. Had someone else been here? Or was this another manifestation of whatever haunted these halls? As I moved further in, I felt it, a chill that sneaked down my spine. The hairs on my neck prickled. I was not alone. A soft whisper skimmed the edges of my hearing, words indistinct but laden with urgency. I turned toward the source, but the room seemed empty, merely a haunting echo of a life once lived. Clenching my fists, I fought the urge to flee. The sense of being watched enveloped me like a shroud. I crept toward the small kitchen area, where the smell of something rancid lingered, clinging to the air. I flipped on the light, and the flickering bulb illuminated a scene that sent my heart into a frenzy. On the table lay the remains of a meal, untouched yet rotting. Molds and mildew festered in the corners, but what caught my attention most was the journal open, pages fluttering slightly in the stale air. Without thinking, I rushed to it, desperate to glean any insight into the horrors surrounding me. The last entry was scrawled hastily, the handwriting erratic and frantic. It watches, it waits. The sea calls to it, and it answers. If you hear the whispers, do not listen. The light must never go out, for it is the only protection we have. If you see the figure, run. Do not be drawn to it. It is not of this world. I dropped the journal, my breath catching in my throat. The room seemed to close in around me. I needed to get back to the lantern room, to the only place where I felt some measure of safety. As I turned to leave, the door slammed shut, the impact echoing ominously in the silence. Panic surged through me. I rattled the handle, but it remained stubbornly locked. I banged against the door, shouting for help, yet the only response was the laughter of the storm outside, mocking my plight. In that moment, the whispers grew louder, swirling around me, calling my name, pulling me with an irresistible force. I stumbled back, clutching my head as the shadows deepened, swallowing the light from the flickering bulb. I was trapped, ensnared in whatever nightmare the lighthouse had become. The last thing I remembered was a flicker of light outside, pulling me toward the window like a moth to a flame. The figure stood there, silhouetted against the waves, and in that instant, I understood. I was not the lighthouse keeper. I was merely another lost soul, drawn to the heart of the horror that lay within.